May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in your eyes, O God. For you are my rock. You are my Redeemer. So first off, happy Pride Month! Woo! I am so happy and honored to be with you on this fine day, in this fine month, worshiping the Lord in this place of healing, justice, and truth. Today we have heard two stories that have much in common. In both we see a widow who is mourning the loss of a son and who is visited by a holy person who then enacts a resuscitation of the deceased. Resuscitation is such a common turn of phrase in the church, to be born again, to be restored through Christ. The story of the MCC itself is a story of resuscitation, of new life in that living room in 1968 when the Reverend Troy Perry refused to ignore his call to ministry, no matter what people told him. And 12 friends joined him for that first service of what would become known as the Metropolitan Community Church. And as with all stories of resurrection and resuscitation, it all turns back to life. There is a death. And so I just want to warn you from the outset that this sermon gets into some dark places. I urge us all to take care of ourselves while we remember our pasts. And it is in this context of resuscitation that we hear the story from the Gospel according to Luke of the widow of Nain. This vignette takes place in the context of Jesus' ministry in Galilee, and all the miracles of his ministry in chapters 7 through 9 of the Gospel of Luke are focused around illustrating that Jesus is no mere prophet. He is the Messiah. The people cry out after the Son has been raised that there must be a prophet among them, unable to realize that really there is a Savior, God's anointed, in their very midst. As Christians, we believe Jesus to be the Messiah, and so the illustration of his power of life over death is demonstrated not only by the story of the widow of Nain, but also in the story of the widow of Zarephath, where Elijah asked God to save the child. Elijah, a prophet, must perform heavy physical labor to save the young man. He lies prostrate upon him, hand to hand and cheek to cheek, stretching his body along body 3 times, and then asks God to send the breath back into the boy. The Holy Book tells us that God heard the voice of Elijah, and that life returns to the deceased. Jesus, on the other hand, as Messiah, need only command the young man. He says, "Verily I say to you, arise," and he sits up in the coffin and begins to speak. The inbreaking of God is needed in both of these stories, the story of Elijah and the widow of Zarephath, and in Jesus and the widow of Nain. Elijah must call out for God to bring life back to the child for whom breath has left. Martin Luther writes in a sermon on the widow of Nain that, without this inbreaking of God through touch of Jesus, quote, "The pallbearers would have still moved on and laid the deceased in his grave and buried him." And yet Jesus refuses to be complacent in the death of the young man. He does not just walk on by, but instead calls out to him with his own word, with his full self as the Logos, as the very word of God, and commands the young man, "I say to you, arise." Without the blessed child of God, the dead young man would have continued to be dead. The widow would have continued to be a woman marked by loss, husbandless, sonless. And so let's talk a bit about the widows in these stories, especially the widow in Nain. The Methodist minister Frank Schaeffer, the Methodist minister defrocked for performing the gay marriage of his son, writes that widows in first century Judea were women on the margins of society. These were women unattached to men, independent women who had to find some sort of work in order to survive, who had to hope that families would provide for them, as Ruth provides for Naomi in the book of Ruth. They were destitute and derided by their society. Widows in first century Judea were like fish without bicycles, women without men, women on their own. It is these women who God has Elijah share a roof with. It is these women who Jesus takes pity on and comforts. And so I want to spend some time really thinking about the implications of these readings. It's worth noting that the lectionary on this third Sunday after Pentecost is also in turn the lectionary for the first Sunday of Pride. This reading works a bit like the readings seen at the beginning of the holy seasons of Lent or of Advent, or as I would argue, Pride Month. These readings both point back to where we were and to where we are going. As it is the first Sunday in Pride, we can read our own history into this passage, but really we should be doing this every day. And so we turn to the dead sons, the young men. In the cases of the story of Elijah and the Sidonian widow in Zarephath, the son becomes ill during the prophet's stay, so ill that the text reads, there was no breath left in him. Elijah holds the still, warm corpse, carries him to his very own room, lays him on his very own bed, and calls the breath of the Lord back to him. The dead son of the widow at the gate in Nain is in a procession that carries the dead body out to be buried. The son is called man here, so we are not to picture the tragic death of a child, but instead the extinguished life of a young man. A man who dies of an illness that takes his breath away. Maybe it's pneumonia. Maybe it's a cancer of the lungs. Maybe it's another opportunistic infection. Who was the son of the widow in Nain? He is not named. His words upon rising from the dead are not recorded, but we might imagine who he is. He was a young man, virile, someone with their whole life ahead of him, a life of promise and health and happiness. And so it starts to become clear who we see laying in the coffin being processed out of the city. The young man cut off from life and tended to by the lonely widow, his mother. This young man becomes the young man in America in the 80s, in the 90s, in the plague years, dying before his time with the telltale mark of Kaposi's sarcoma, the incomprehensible death of a healthy young person from an otherwise minor illness. The widow's son is the victim of the gay plague, the illness whose ribbon graces the very Christ candle on our communion table, a victim of AIDS. When he is brought back to life, the first thing that happens, the gospel tells us, is he speaks. When silence equals death, the newfound life demands that it speak out and be heard. I wonder, who comes to your mind when you imagine the young man in the coffin? And who is the widow, the woman on the edge of society, the caretaker for the dying man, the grieving mother figure who follows the coffin dutifully out of the city gates? When hospitals were denying the dying at their own gates, when nurses pushed trays of food under doors, lesbian women with medical knowledge, or just a feeling of unity with the community of gay men who had previously mocked them, degraded them, pitied them, so tied up in their own internalized misogyny and homophobia, it was these women who took time to touch disease-riddled bodies of our own community. Our people took care of our people. Like the physical labor of Elijah, which restored life, these brave women accompanied and calmed and comforted in death. Perhaps the widows are the Judean equivalent of Wendy Sue Begelson, Nicolette Ibarra, and Barbara Vick, founders of the Blood Sisters in San Diego, who hosted blood drives for lesbians to provide the vital liquid of vitality to their queer brothers. For mothers indeed nurtured their sons with their own blood. Perhaps these widows were the Judean equivalent of what one doctoral thesis calls the butch nightingales, nurses on the front line. For mother figures healed the bruises and cuts of their children. Perhaps these widows were the Judean equivalent of Margaret Bausch, a lesbian nurse who, upon graduating from nursing school, asked to be transferred to the HIV/AIDS unit at a nearby hospital. For mother figures desired to be closer to their people even in death. I wonder what other mothers and mother figures come to our minds now. But like all stories, the stories from Zarephath and the story of Nain must come to an end, and end they do. And we are left to wonder, what happened next? Did they talk about this event often? The widow and the son? Did they ignore it and try to move past it? Does it define their relationship? I ask these questions as a queer person who was born in 1986, the year AZT was first tested at NIH, and tens of thousands of gay people had already died in the 5 years since AIDS was first discovered in the US. Growing up, I only knew of the epidemic through Dateline and 2020 specials, from the skinny man at the Supercuts who wore Hawaiian shirts over dry, cracked skin, who spoke with a Harvey Firestein voice, who my mom never let cut my hair because she said he might cut himself, and then you might get what he has, and what he has is something bad. Well, I have to say I do have what he has, not the virus that wrapped his body, but I and queer people of my age have that same blood in our veins, the same breath of God that was breathed back into the body of that child at Zarephath who was thirsty for air. Queer youth and young people today have the same blood as the man carried out of Nain, mourned by the mother figure at the edge of society. The blood that coursed through veins weekly until Jesus Christ touched them and said, "I say to you, arise." This is the blood of straight women of color, a blood that today makes it so that HIV/AIDS-related illnesses is the leading cause of death among Black women in America between the ages of 25 and 34. Just as Elijah's prophetic career began inside him, with the resurrection of a child who is not Israelite, so too must we extend our own view of who is affected by HIV/AIDS and whose life force we see as common with our own. And so I watched the film, How to Survive a Plague, to watch the history of my people. From the protests of ACT UP to men hugging skeletal friends and lovers in hospital beds. And I know that their blood is mine. The resurrection of the man in Nain and the child in Zarephath is the resurrection of the queer community, the community that has resurrected the word queer and so much more. The plague never took us all out. We are still here. People like me are still here in thanks to the inbreaking of the spirit that demanded drugs and treatments, the spirit that organized meal plans and hospital visits, the spirit that brought lesbians to the bedside of gay men who had derided them. This spirit lives on. It is the spirit of the risen Christ who commanded the young man in Nain, "I say to you, arise." So too are we commanded by Christ. We are an arisen people, a resurrection people, brought back to life through his healing ministry on heaven and earth. We are a resurrection people, both as Christians and as LGBTQ people, with thanks to God, and in loving memory of the befallen by prejudice and hatred. We are a resurrection people, commanded by our very Lord and Savior, "I say to you, arise." Happy Pride, and amen.